Hello, my name is Ashley Mason, and I am a clinical psychologist at the UCSF Department of Psychiatry and at the UCSF Osher Center for Integrative Health. I'm here to talk with you today about sauna and heat therapies as tools for health and longevity. First, a disclosure. I've begun advising Aura Health, which makes a wearable ring that functions much like a Fitbit or an Apple Watch, in October of 2021. But let's get to this. You don't have to dig too deep to find incredibly widespread use of heat practices across cultures. For example, Korean kilns open after a round of charcoal production is complete. After the logs are removed, these mines hover around 200 degrees Fahrenheit for 2 days. People come and use them as saunas. First Americans have used sweat lodges to hold ceremonies for spiritual healing. Russians have used the banya as early as 945 AD. Banya is a Slavic term for using a steam bath with a wood stove, diving into a cold lake, and getting a massage with eucalyptus leaves and honey. Sounds pretty good, right? Finnish people have used the sauna as early as 7000 BC for everything ranging from a place to give birth to a place to live in the coldest times of year. People long ago used sauna to support their spiritual and mental well being, in addition to other more practical purposes. And a recent study showed that people today use sauna to relax, cope with stress, socialize, manage pain, improve their mental health, improve their sleep, and many other things. But beyond motivations, there are epidemiological data, which means data tracking the same people over time in a non experimental way, as well as experimental studies that we can talk about too. In fact, there's more out there than I can review in this talk, but hopefully this slide gives you an idea. It's promising to see epidemiological data showing associations between greater sauna use and lesser frequency or severity of some of the most difficult to treat and chronic conditions that decrease healthy life years here in the US and in other countries. Experimental data have also shown benefits in areas especially associated with longevity and aging, in particular cardiovascular disease, dementia and Alzheimer's disease, and stroke. Next, I'm going to review some of the research that has been done looking at the association between heat therapies and these medical conditions, as our risk for these medical conditions increases as we age, and data suggest that we might be able to reduce these risks by using some heat practices. I'll start with cardiovascular disease. In Finland, almost everybody uses the sauna. So they are a great population to study the sauna in some ways, but in other ways, they are challenging because finding people who don't use the sauna to do comparisons with can be difficult to do. For the Finland data, I'm talking about the use of a dry sauna, the kind with rocks, and it's generally at about 175 degrees Fahrenheit. First, let's start with sauna as a way to reduce cardiovascular disease risk. In a Finnish longitudinal study, compared to people who saunaed once per week, those who saunaed 2 to 3 times per week were 23% less likely to die of a sudden cardiovascular death. And those who saunaed 4 to 7 times per week were an astounding 48% less likely. And that was after taking into account other healthy and unhealthy behaviors that people do, like exercise or smoke. Next, let's talk about sauna as a way to improve cardiovascular disease once it's already been diagnosed. One study of folks with congestive heart failure showed that 2 weeks of infrared heat treatments were associated with fewer premature ventricular contractions relative to a control group that didn't get sauna treatments. In another study of people with inoperable ischemic heart disease, 15 infrared heat sessions over 3 weeks improved vascular endothelial function. Sauna also reduced pain and improved lower extremity blood flow in people with peripheral artery disease. This study gave 50 infrared heat treatments over 10 weeks, and they did the study twice, both in a single arm trial and in a randomized study that included a control group. In the randomized study, the patients who got the heat treatment experienced benefits that the people who got the control group treatment did not. You might be wondering about infrared heat, which I just mentioned. These types of saunas are everywhere these days, and more studies are starting to use this type of heating element. In particular, studies using infrared heat in Japan have been reporting improved cardiovascular function in parameters of cardiovascular health in people with existing heart disease. I could go on and describe benefits for blood pressure, dyslipidemia, and other important factors that influence heart disease, but we would be here all day. So I'll cut to the chase. By now, you might be wondering, but how might sauna actually be exerting all of these beneficial effects for the heart? Well, one pathway is through mimicking exercise. Several studies have shown that sauna can mimic exercise. For example, in one study, the researchers compared a 25-minute sauna session to a 30-minute stationary bike ride. They found that both the sauna and the exercise on the bike increased heart rate and increased blood pressure. This isn't terribly surprising, right? When we go in the sauna, we can get sweaty, our heart rate can increase, and so on. And that's also what happens when we exercise. And as a sidebar, for those of you interested in building and maintaining muscle mass, some research has also shown that heat treatments can prevent muscle loss and promote muscle growth. Next, let's review some research that's been done on sauna use and risk for dementia, Alzheimer's disease, and stroke. As we just did, let's start with sauna as a way to possibly reduce risk for dementia, Alzheimer's disease, and stroke. We are again going to look at the Finnish data because they are probably the country with the most well-documented sauna use behavior. People who use the sauna 4 to 7 times per week, relative to those who use the sauna once a week, were 66 and 65% less likely to develop dementia or Alzheimer's disease, respectively. And the data are similarly impressive for stroke, with people using the sauna 4 to 7 times a week being 62% less likely to have a stroke relative to those who use the sauna 0 or 1 time per week. And the length of the time in the sauna does matter. Using the sauna for at least 19 minutes gives you the biggest benefit. That is, using the sauna for at least 19 minutes was better than using the sauna for 18 or fewer minutes. And again, the sauna temperature we're talking about here is about 174 degrees Fahrenheit. Unlike heart disease, we know less about how to treat people with dementia and Alzheimer's, so we don't have data on sauna use as a treatment for these conditions. But how might sauna go about reducing risk for developing dementia, Alzheimer's, or strokes in the first place? Well, sauna improves several known risk factors for dementia, Alzheimer's disease, and stroke. For example, sauna use can lower blood pressure, it can increase heat shock protein expression, and it can also improve vascular function, among other things. These have been studied in experimental designs, meaning we have data that show that sauna directly impacts these factors. Those are good things to improve in order to reduce your risk for dementia, Alzheimer's disease, and stroke. Finally, and we know from experimental studies, heat treatments can target depression symptoms. And we also know that depression is associated with poorer health in general, greater risk for heart disease, and so on. I won't go into a lot of detail, but several studies have used a variety of heat sources, from hot tubs to infrared saunas to dry saunas, and found that these treatments are associated with reduced depression symptoms. This is great news because folks might have easier access to hot tubs than saunas, for example. And it's easier to convince someone with depression to sit in a hot tub than to, say, go for a run. So this might be an important tool in the toolkit for combating depression. So now I'd like to boil this down into some practical suggestions for how you can incorporate heat practices into your life. Finding what you like and what works for your life is probably more important than concerning yourself about the heat source. It seems that loads of the benefits have more to do with heat and perhaps less to do with the heat source. If you can access a hot tub, great. There are studies that have shown that hot tubs can have benefits in cardiovascular factors, particularly blood pressure, as well as depression. If you can access dry saunas, great. I've just reviewed oodles of studies that used these to show benefits for health. Infrared heat has also become more popular and has also been found to improve cardiovascular risk factors, particularly in the context of Wei-on therapy in Japan. And it's also been found effective in reducing depression symptoms, both in work that I've done and work that others have done. My current ongoing work at the Osher Center uses infrared heat. Make sure that you consider that it might take your heart rate time to slow down after doing a heat practice. And it's hard to fall asleep when your heart is racing. So some people find that it's better to have at least an hour after you do a heat practice before you intend to go to sleep. Some people have no problems going right to bed after using a sauna or a hot tub. You'll have to figure out what works for you, and it will likely depend on the intensity of your heat practice. For example, is a gentle heat for a short time in a hot tub that is not very hot, or a longer time in a very hot, dry sauna going to affect you differently? And the answer is probably yes. Also, electrolyte beverages can help, but beware of sugars and artificial colors. There are several great brands on the market that you can consider. In our lab at the UCSF Osher Center, we use Noon tablets, and we use these electrolyte beverages for participants in our sauna studies after they've completed their sauna sessions and are seeking to rehydrate themselves. Now, a few more specifics. These are questions that people ask me the most. In the case of heat practices, the more days per week you can do them, the better. 4 to 7 days per week is the best, but 2 to 3 days a week still buys you considerable cardiovascular benefits. Remember, cardiovascular disease is the #1 killer of men and women. When it comes to heat practice use, longer is better. Epidemiological data suggests that at least 19 minutes plus is probably best if you can do it. Please know that you will likely need to work up to this slowly. Think of heat practices as a marathon. You want this to be sustainable for the long term. Finally, hotter is probably better, but only to a point. We know from data from Finland that saunas are typically pretty hot, around 174 degrees. But Wei-on therapy, which is infrared heat in Japan, uses less hot saunas, and that has also shown benefits. What this may come down to is how you feel. If you're sweating and noticing an increase in your heart rate, you're probably getting benefits. And over time, you will probably be able to tolerate hotter temperatures for longer periods of time. So in closing, thank you so much for your attention. I hope that you found this informative, and I also hope that you might have gotten some inspiration to go out there and enjoy your favorite heat source. Thank you very much.
Hello, thanks for joining me today. I'm Dr. Apple Bodemer. I'm a professor of dermatology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I'm going to talk with you today about ages and the skin. We might have to start over because I'm not able to advance.
No problem. You could just say the start at the beginning again. Yeah.
Okay, now it's advancing. I don't know why it wouldn't do that before. Okay, we're restarting. Hi, I'm Dr. Apple Bodemer. I'm a professor of dermatology at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, and I'm here to talk to you today about ages and the skin. So the first question you might have is, what is an age? We're all thinking about aging. Is our skin aging? How our bodies are aging? How can we anti-age? But when I'm talking about ages today, I'm talking about a very specific compound called an advanced glycation end product. These are very stable molecules that form when sugars attach to proteins, to fats, and to DNA. The rate at which this process occurs depends greatly on the amount of available sugar, i.e. blood sugar, and it's also accelerated by heat. And you can see in this little cartoon, that's kind of what's happening. We have proteins and sugars, and in the presence of heat and time, they convert into these advanced glycation end products. The specific reaction is called the Maillard reaction. And I bring it up because you might have heard of it in food preparation and food chemistry. And we can see here that we have the protein, the phospholipids, aminophospholipids, and nucleic acids or DNA. And specifically, certain amino acids are more prone to becoming glycosylated. In the presence of a sugar, we get this reaction that goes back and forth a little bit, and it is reversible in the early stages to what we call a Schiff base and then an amidori product. Something that you might have heard about is the hemoglobin A1C. This is something that a lot of doctors check to see what your blood sugar has been like over several months. That's also reversible. But as we progress down this reaction, the reversibility starts to slow down. And by the time we get to the end stage, these advanced glycation end products, it's no longer reversible. And those sugars are permanently attached to the proteins, fats, or DNA. So what's the big deal about that? Well, we have here these ages interact with a receptor on many different cells called the RAGE. And it's a really good name for that particular receptor because once that is activated, it creates a whole bunch of downstream effects within the cell that lead to increased inflammation, increased oxidative stress, and cell damage. There are several diseases that have been associated with elevated ages levels, including diabetes, kidney disease, cardiovascular disease, eye diseases, diseases of the nerves, diseases of the brains, and including tumor progression. So that seems pretty serious. We'd all want to decrease our level of ages in general if we could. Specifically today, though, we're talking about the skin and what these compounds do in the skin. These, as I mentioned, once we get to the end stages, are permanent. They are permanently attached to those proteins. So the rate of our ability to clear those ages from the system really depends on the life of that particular protein. So longer lived proteins or longer lasting proteins are much more susceptible to the impact of glycosylation or glycation than proteins that turn over very quickly. In particular, collagen has a very long half-life, and in the skin, collagen has about a half-life of 15 years. So if today I form an age in one of my skin cells on my hand, that's going to be there for potentially up to 15 years. Cartilage is even longer half-life. That has a half-life of about 117 years. Elastin is another important compound in the skin that helps give our skin elasticity and structure as well. And the half-life of elastin is about 70 years. So you can see that if at age, these sugars, these glycated sugars get attached to these particular proteins, they're going to hang around for a long time. When this happens, we see more cross-linking of the collagen, which weakens the structural integrity of the skin. It impairs the ability for the skin to remodel and rejuvenate itself. We see decreased elasticity with both an impact on elastin and in collagen. And then these ages can actually increase pigmentation by accelerating the activity of the pigment-producing cells in the skin. So what we end up with is more dry, more wrinkled, more dyspigmented skin, or more blotchy pigmentation. So ages can come from a variety of sources, including UV exposure, UV radiation exposure, as well as some environmental pollutants, but diet plays a big role, and it's one that we don't often think about. We used to think that dietary ages didn't really matter because we ate them, they got broken down in the gut, and they didn't really get incorporated into our system at all. But this recent study out of Rotterdam showed that that's not true. And there have been other studies that have shown that as well. This particular one included over 2,500 Dutch participants, and what they used food frequency questionnaires to estimate dietary intake of ages. And then they used a measure called skin autofluorescence. So this is kind of interesting and cool because these ages, when these glycated proteins, fats, and DNAs are in the skin, they fluoresce at a specific wavelength. And that can be measured by a machine that can measure the reflection of those ages in the skin. And what they found that dietary intake definitely does correlate to skin autofluorescence, which is a measure of the amount of ages in the skin. What they also found was they didn't really see that difference in people who had diabetes or who had kidney disease. And at the end of that study, what they concluded was because people who have diabetes end up creating a lot of ages because they have a lot of sugar in their blood typically. And the same thing with kidney disease, we're not able to clear dietary ages as well. So we end up with just huge numbers of ages that didn't allow us to see differences in that particular population. But it is clear that ages that we eat do impact the level of skin ages as well. So where do we get these ages in our diet? All food is going to have some level of ages, and the some level to create ages when they're prepared in specific ways. Animal-based foods that are high in fat and protein have the highest levels of ages, and they also have the highest level to have potential to form ages when they're prepared in specific ways. Vegetables, fruits, and whole grains have much lower levels of ages and lower potential to form ages. So what is this food preparation I'm talking about that can make these bad guys worse? This Maillard reaction is often a desired outcome in the food preparation industry. It creates color, flavor, texture, that brown and golden color that we're looking for in steaks or potatoes, baked potatoes or French fries. So we get this with browning, charring, grilling, broiling, baking, roasting, frying, anything that gives us high heat and low water. That can increase ages level by more than 10 to 100 fold. okay, so what can we do to try to minimize these if they're in everything, and a lot of the ways that we prepare food creates more of them? So cooking with moist heat, so low temperature and moist heat over longer periods of time, will minimize the amount of ages that we get from food preparation. So stewing or steaming. Another thing that can be helpful, it doesn't necessarily negate it, but when we marinate food with an acidic medium, like vinegar or lemon juice or tomato juice, that helps slow down that Maillard reaction, and by keeping the pH level lower. And I wanted to give you just a brief idea. We're not going to go into this table in detail, but you can see here, chicken has a relative ages level of 4,000. And when it's grilled, that jumps up to 14,000. If we look at eggs, poached is 27. If it's scrambled in vegetable oil, it jumps to 57. And if it's scrambled in butter, it jumps up to 101. So that's that high saturated fat. We can see on the other side, so apples, raw is about 13, and when it's baked, that jumps to 45. So we still do see jumps, but in terms of the high fat, high protein, animal-based foods, on the other side of this table, we can see that grains, fruits, and vegetables are much lower. And I had to use potatoes as my vegetable example because we can see what happens to potatoes if it's boiled or roasted. When we deep fry something, you can see how dramatically that level of ages increases in that food. And that's what I hope for you today. I hope you've learned something that helps you live a better, healthier life.
All right, let's go ahead and get started. My name is John Rogers. I'm on the faculty here at Northwestern University in the Department of Biomedical Engineering. I want to thank the organizers of this event for giving me a chance to contribute this presentation, where I'll focus on classes of technologies that we think have relevance to longevity and healthy aging, specifically soft wireless electronic and microfluidic sensors for monitoring physiological health. So as I mentioned, I'm here at Northwestern University. We actually have a dedicated institute to developing technologies of this sort called the Query Simpson Institute for Bioelectronics, which really facilitates research at the boundaries between engineering, my own core expertise, and the medical community, where there's a strong emphasis on translation, building scientific foundations for inventive technologies that can really move the needle in terms of how we care for patients. And I'll share with you some highlights of our activities in the context of this institute over the next 10 minutes or so. The overall goal of activities within this institute is to try to leverage the sophistication that is developed in the semiconductor industry to support consumer electronics gadgetry for purposes in monitoring human health. So specifically, we would like to reformulate the classes of silicon wafer-based technologies, integrated circuits, digital sensors, wireless communication capabilities, data storage, and so on, to allow their deployment in, on, or around soft living tissues over long periods of time in a way that's sort of imperceptible and presenting minimal risk to the patient. And some of these devices involve combinations of materials. In particular, we take hard electronic materials, but we distribute them in sort of spider web mesh type layouts embedded in soft biocompatible elastomers to achieve the kind of electronic functionality that we're aiming to support for monitoring purposes, but in physical forms, in classes of platforms that have mechanical properties matched to soft tissues of the human body. So from an engineering standpoint, you can consider these systems as hard, soft, hybrid combinations of functional materials surrounded by soft elastomeric matrices. And in the specific context of the technologies I'll share with you today, we design these to have skin-like physical characteristics. So think of them as almost like electronic temporary tattoos is kind of the vision that we've had, that support kind of an intimate interface to the skin, but in a way that's imperceptible from the standpoint of mechanics loading and interface stresses that might otherwise cause discomfort. And so we've been working on these technologies now for about 10 years. We've developed all of the engineering foundations for doing this kind of thing. And one representative device is shown in this particular slide. Again, a tattoo-like system, skin-like in its physical properties, the thickness, the stiffness, the thermal mass, the water vapor transmission characteristics. So it's almost like a second layer of skin mounted directly on living skin, where that device can exploit the skin interface for measuring underlying physiological processes with clinical grade precision. So think about doing ICU grade patient monitoring, but now with these skin-like wireless devices that can be deployed not only in a hospital setting, but in a home setting as well, in a way that's not disruptive to natural daily activities. So we have quite a bit of momentum in this space, wide-ranging classes of devices with those characteristics. They can mount on any relevant part of the anatomy. They're not constrained as a conventional wearable to the wrist or the finger. They can be placed anywhere across the body to satisfy monitoring requirements that are relevant to care of patients with various conditions. And so this was a highlight piece that was featured in National Geographic a couple of years ago. So we have devices that support all kinds of electronic monitoring functionality, but we can also do the same kind of thing with lab-on-a-chip microfluidic platforms, where we're monitoring not only biophysical signatures of physiological health, cardiopulmonary activity, for example, but also biochemical markers of health using sweat as an unconventional but pretty interesting class of biofluid that can be captured in a completely non-invasive way that doesn't require penetration of the skin, which would be, kind of a requirement for getting access to interstitial fluid or blood. And so we can create soft microfluidic platforms, gently adhere them to the surface of the skin. The eccrine sweat glands serve as a pumping source for moving sweat through the various channels and reservoirs and valves in these particular types of devices. We can co-integrate electronics for measuring specific biomarkers that are present in sweat, which is a rich source of biomolecular information relevant to health status. We can do that electronically, or we can use colorimetric chemical reagents that change in color by an amount that's directly proportional to the concentration of that particular biomarker. So it's providing sort of real-time in situ biochemical assessments of health status as an alternative to blood draws and lab-based blood analysis. And so here's an example of one of these devices mounted on the outer forearm of a graduate student who was involved in this work. This was the first publication of this kind of technology. And you can see there's a serpentine channel running around the perimeter of this device. There's a color changing chemistry embedded in that channel that allows us to determine the extent of filling of sweat into that particular channel, thereby allowing us to determine the total amount of sweat lost from that specific region of the skin and the sweat rate. And then there are 4 circular reservoirs that have colorimetric reagents that allow us to determine the glucose level of sweat, the pH of sweat, the lactate level, and the chloride concentration in sweat as a metric for electrolyte loss. So very relevant in the context of hydration management. So with those 2 platforms, skin-like electronics, skin-like microfluidics, you can do a tremendous amount in terms of continuous physiological monitoring of health status. Multimodal, you can include multiple different types of sensors, clinical grade quality, continuous, and cost-effective for use not only in well-developed parts of the globe, but also in lower and middle-income countries that are resource constrained. So thermal, electrical, fluidic, mechanical, optical, body sounds can all be monitored with these kinds of systems. We explored them initially in a class of patient that we thought could benefit most strongly from this kind of wireless skin-like device technology, premature babies specifically, that enter into the neonatal intensive care unit, requiring tremendous amount of monitoring because of their fragile health status. But with kind of monitoring capabilities that can be replaced entirely with these skin-like wireless systems. And so we've really deployed that, developed the technology to a very high state of readiness. We've gotten FDA approvals. We've deployed them into multiple hospitals around the world. This is an example of a baby being monitored at Lurie Children's Hospital here in Chicago in their NICU. We've also deployed them into lower and middle income countries in collaborations with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Save the Children organization, Zambia, Kenya, Ghana, Mexico, and Pakistan, in fact. And those are ongoing deployments focused not only on neonatal health, but maternal fetal health as well. And so this is an example of a deployment into Zambia, first launch of these devices into that part of the world in late 2019. As I mentioned, it's now FDA approved. It's entering a commercial pipeline through a startup company that emerged from our group a couple of years ago, and they're active in 20 countries now. And there's some of the statistics around that technology. So we focused a lot of our work on early beginning of life health challenges, but these same technologies can be used to address questions around healthy aging and longevity. And so let me give you one example of that, where we're working with stroke survivors, Alzheimer's patients, Parkinson's, dementia patients who suffer from aphasia and dysphagia. And we work in collaboration with rehabilitation specialists at the Shirley Ryan Ability Lab. In this case, we developed soft devices that mount at the suprasternal notch to capture swallowing activity, vocalization activity that can be used to personalize rehabilitation strategies for these patients who have to relearn how to speak, and in many cases have to relearn how to swallow. And it turns out that location on the body is tremendously information rich beyond just speaking and swallowing, the various kinds of cardiopulmonary monitoring capabilities as well. So kind of a single device at a unique location in the body, providing comprehensive health status monitoring. So you can measure voice. In this case, it's not a microphone, so you're not confounded by ambient noises. You're measuring vibratory signatures of speech from motions of the surface of the skin, so you can capture vocalization events, talk time, talk cadence, and so on. And that's very, very important. But not only in the context of aphasia, we think of it as a loneliness meter. You can determine from the frequency of speaking and conversations, how lonely an individual is. And I think this is emerging as an epidemic, especially for the elderly population. So we think this could be a very powerful device for establishing a metric for loneliness and providing a trigger for intervening and sort of addressing that loneliness challenge. And so this is another use case that we're quite interested in. But as I mentioned, swallow monitoring is now possible sort of in a home setting, moving that kind of bulky wire-based technology into a wearable form that can be deployed not only in a hospital, but in the home as well, for real-time feedback on swallow behavior to allow patients who are suffering from dysphagia an ability to effectively relearn how to swallow. Sleep studies as well, a very natural application for this technology. So with that, I'd like to just go ahead and conclude. We're an engineering team, but we work very closely with clinical medical community. We have many IRB approved studies ongoing, commercialization efforts, FDA approval, really soup the nuts in terms of academic research, leading the technologies that are now in early stages of deployment to patients in need. And so I'll just conclude by acknowledging the students and the postdocs, the medical students and the staff scientists who actually do the work. I just get to talk about it, but these are really creative, high energy people, deeply engaged with that medical community. So thanks again for involving me in this important event.